Okay, 8 o'clock, so we're going to get started, folks. My name's Kip Nicely. I'm with the Governor Gary Johnson campaign, GaryJohnson2012.com if you're online. We want to welcome you to our third national town hall. It's with Yowie.com. And it's going to be a different format tonight. Governor Johnson will be introduced first by Professor Robert Guttman here from the University of, or Johns Hopkins University. They're sharing space here tonight with University of California, Washington. We want to welcome our live audience here tonight, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions as well as our national and international audience that is online with Yowie.com. We've at times had these as specific topics that the Governor has spoken on tonight as an open forum, so get your questions ready. For those in the live audience here, if you could just form up to your right, and we'll queue you up, and you'll be sitting in this chair and sitting down and asking the Governor whatever questions on your mind. He doesn't screen anything in advance. We don't pre-pick the questions, so open up and ask anything that you'd like to him, and this is your opportunity to get those questions answered. This is important. We've got a presidential contest coming up about 1 year from tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Professor Guttman, who will do the introductions for Governor Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. My name is Bob Guttman. I'm the Director of the Center on Politics and Foreign Relations over at Johns Hopkins, and I'm also a visiting professor here at the University of California. So I thank you all for coming. I usually do these with the Financial Times in the morning, but tonight I'm honored to have presidential candidate, GOP presidential candidate Gary Johnson, who you may not have seen in the debates because he hasn't been in a lot of debates, which is not good. And hopefully he'll be in a couple more of the debates coming up. But he's a former governor of New Mexico, a two-term governor of New Mexico, a very successful businessman, a mountain climber who's climbed several Mount Everest and several other high peaks around the world. And he's as I just noticed here, a magazine called him one of the sanest candidates for president. As I said, he's a fiscal conservative, but he's a social libertarian. He believes in a limited government, and he stands apart from quite a few of the other candidates. And he has a view on drugs that's interesting, that's different than the other candidates. He has a view on immigration and offense on our borders that's different than the other candidates. And he's a candidate that thinks he could beat Barack Obama in November 2012. So I'm honored to introduce Governor Gary Johnson. Great.
I made very few promises when I ran for governor of New Mexico. But I kept all of the promises that I made. I'm making very few promises running for president of the United States. I'm promising three things. One is I promise to submit a balanced budget to Congress in the year 2013. Now that isn't promising to balance the budget. That's promising to submit a balanced budget to Congress in the year 2013. That's going to be a document that is going to lay out a 43% reduction in federal spending. Now, so many look at that as such a negative. Let's look at the positive here. The positive is that we save this country from what I think is a monetary collapse, and it's just due to the mathematics of continuing to spend more money than what we take in. So to prevent that monetary collapse, that's what we do. Now, what's a monetary collapse? That's what happened in Russia. And what happened in Russia is that the ruble inflated to the point where it wasn't worth anything. So what was daily life in Russia like when the ruble wasn't worth anything? Well, here's what happened in Russia. Russia developed the most sophisticated barter system of any country that the planet has ever known, where basically if you worked in the chainsaw factory and you went out and you worked all week, you got paid with a chainsaw on Friday. And you took the chainsaw, and within a matter of hours, you traded the chainsaw for milk and eggs and gasoline and clothing And that's how it worked. I don't know if we really want to do that in this country, but that's a monetary collapse. That's a way of life that none of us can envision. And so that's the negative side of a monetary collapse. That's the negative side of continuing to spend more money than what we take in. On the positive side, which is what we all ought to be looking at, is that we can fix this. We can actually prevent this from happening. But to do that, what we need to do is balance the budget. So I am promising to submit a balanced budget to Congress in the year 2013. I'm also promising to veto legislation where expenses exceed revenue. Now, first of all, I'm elected President of the United States promising to do these two things. What is America shouting at Congress if I'm elected President of the United States? Balance the budget. That's what they're shouting. Balance the budget. Promising to veto legislation that exceeds revenue. I would like you to know that I'm not adverse to vetoing bills. I may have vetoed more bills as governor of New Mexico than the other 49 governors in the country combined. I vetoed 750 bills while I was governor of New Mexico. I had thousands of line item vetoes as governor of New Mexico. Only 2 were overridden, so it made a difference when it came to billions of dollars worth of spending. It made a difference when it came to government telling you or I what we should or shouldn't do in the bedroom, which is something that I don't think government should be legislating. So, promising to submit a balanced budget to Congress in the year 2013, which would be the fiscal year 2014, promising to veto expenditures that exceed revenue, I suggest to you that if you have a president that's going to do those two things, that number one, Congress will have to override the veto, which they'll do, but I suggest to you that spending will be lower in this scenario than any other possible scenario. So when people talk about, well, you can't cut spending. You can't cut spending. It'll be too much of a hardship. How much of a hardship is it going to be for you to pick up your chainsaw on a Friday afternoon after working all week long and then going out and bartering that chainsaw for what it is that you need? That's going to be real hardship. The third thing that I'm promising to do is I'm promising to advocate on the part of the fair tax. If you haven't checked out the fair tax, check it out. fairtax.org. It will really, as the name implies, be fair. It'll reboot the American economy. It does away with all existing federal tax. It does away with federal withholdings from your payroll check. Those withholdings will come out of the proceeds of the fair tax. So it does away with income tax, it does away with corporate tax, it does away with withholdings, it does away with the IRS. It's a 23% federal consumption tax. Now, if you're thinking 23% federal consumption tax, you're going to add 23% cost to all goods and services? Yes, new goods and services, but contained in all goods and services right now is 23% tax. It's just not transparent. So Coca-Cola today that sells for $1 has 23% tax built into that dollar. You enact the fair tax, and in a very short amount of time, Coca-Cola doesn't have to sell that Coke for $1 anymore to get the same profit. They can sell it for 80 cents. So it ends up to be cost neutral over a very short amount of time. When you talk about competitiveness with Chinese goods, imagine American goods and services costing or being able to be sold at 23% less. That's making American goods and services competitive. It's not regressive because it issues everyone in the country a $200 a month prebate check, which allows everyone in the country, each of us get $2,400 a year from the government, paid ahead of time. It allows all of us to pay for the fair tax up to the point of the poverty level. It's kind of an unavoidable fair tax that gets charged. Because it eliminates corporate income tax along with individual income tax, if in a business environment of zero corporate tax, this country does not, the private sector in this country does not create tens of millions of jobs, I don't know under what scenario that you would have tens of millions of jobs created. It will happen. So this is really optimistic. Reboot the American economy for the next 100 years and do it in a way that's fair. I was at Occupy Wall Street a couple of weeks ago. I share in the outrage of Occupy Wall Street that this country doles it out unfairly. And at the heart of doling it out unfairly is money. And it's people that pay money, it's groups that pay money, it's politicians that pay money to get unfair treatment, to buy loopholes from politicians. Politicians take the money and they pass the special legislation that doesn't dole it out fairly. What this country can provide is a level playing field that all of us can have equal opportunity to the American dream. This is, in my opinion, really exciting. It's the fair tax. It's fair. It's as the name implies. The more money you make, the more fair tax you'll pay. It will also promote savings. So what we need to do to prevent a monetary collapse is we need to stop printing money. We balance the federal budget. We can stop printing money for ongoing needs in this country. Because we're promoting savings with the fair tax, when it comes to the rollover of the $15 trillion in debt that this country currently has, it's a lot more Americans having money to be able to invest, perhaps, in U.S. treasuries as opposed to the United States government having to print that rollover. So that's also another component of all this that points toward us having to deal with this issue now. Talking a little bit about a 43% reduction in federal spending. How do you do that? Well, I think you need to start off by talking about Medicaid and Medicare. As governor of New Mexico, I oversaw the reform of Medicaid in New Mexico, which is health care to the poor. I got an insurance policy as governor of New Mexico. It was issued by Presbyterian Health Care in New Mexico. We did the math. What if we gave every Medicaid recipient in New Mexico my health insurance policy as governor of New Mexico? Would we really save hundreds of millions of dollars by doing that? Because it was a fee-for-service model in New Mexico that we were now going to change to a managed care model, which in essence was giving everybody the insurance policy that I had, my health insurance policy. And yes, that's exactly what we did. And yes, we saved hundreds of millions of dollars, and we set up a better healthcare network in the state, much better healthcare network. I believe that if I were given control, or if I were to have overseen the delivery of healthcare to the poor in New Mexico, that if I were given 43% less money by the federal government, if the federal government would have eliminated all the strings and the mandates associated with Medicaid, but allowed me free rein on how I was going to deliver health care to the poor, with 43% less money, I believe that I could have effectively overseen that delivery. Medicare in this country is the same model. Medicare is a fee-for-service model nationally. Give it to the states. If I would have been, I maintain that if I would have been given health care delivery to those over 65, that if the federal government would have given the state of New Mexico 43% less money than what they were currently spending, done away with all the strings and the mandates associated on how that was supposed to be administered, that I could have done that in New Mexico. So give Medicare and Medicaid to the states, 50 laboratories of innovation and best practice, and that's what you're going to have nationwide. You're going to have 50 laboratories working on this, and there's going to be some fabulous success that'll get emulated. There'll be some pretty spectacular failure that we'll all avoid, but the notion of Washington knows best, the notion that Washington one size fits all, that has us in the predicament that we're in. That's Medicaid, that's Medicare with a 43% reduction, and that's how we make that take place. Military spending. In this document, in my promise to submit a balanced budget to Congress in the year 2013, is going to be a 43% reduction in military spending. I think the biggest threat to our national security is the fact that we're spending so much more money than what we're taking in, and that we're bankrupt, and that if we don't fix this, we're going to find ourselves in the midst of a monetary collapse. So, military spending. Can we provide a strong national defense for this country and still cut military spending by 43%? I think the operative question here is defense. The operative word is defense, and yes, we can, as opposed to offense and as opposed to nation building. So, 43% reduction in military spending. Do we need 2,300 nuclear warheads? Do we need to blow up the world 9 times, or will 4 times do? So I think we can cut our nuclear warheads from 2,300 to 500. I think that we can reduce our military presence worldwide by 43%. Do we need 100,000 troops in Europe? Might 57,000 troops do? I have a hard time understanding why we have any troops at all in Europe, much less 100,000. So I think there's room to do this. Those in uniform, the civilian support to those in uniform, research and development. We seem to continue to be fighting wars in the past as opposed to what's happening in the future. And we've talked about this for decades, but we've never really taken steps to make sure that that happens. And then the conflicts that we're currently involved in. I was opposed to Iraq before we went into Iraq. I think there needs to be a military threat from abroad before we take military action. I didn't see that Iraq had any weapons of mass destruction, but if they would have had weapons of mass destruction, this is going back to 2003, gosh, don't we have the military surveillance capability to see them roll out these weapons of mass destruction? And if they do, we can go in and deal with that. If we go into Iraq, aren't we going to find ourselves in a civil war to which there would be no end? Afghanistan, I thought initially, was totally warranted. We were attacked, we attacked back, and after having been in Afghanistan for 6 months, we wiped out Al-Qaeda. That was 10 years ago. So we're building roads, schools, bridges, highways, and hospitals in Iraq and Afghanistan and other countries in the world, and don't we have those same needs here in this country? Libya. I was opposed to Libya and issued a paper on that immediately. Aren't we still involved in a civil war in Libya? Where was the military threat from Libya? And we're going to end up picking a winner and loser in Libya. And might that turn out similar to Mubarak in Egypt, where this turned out to be the lesser of two evils, and we were making that decision as opposed to the Egyptian people? Let's stop our foreign involvement in other countries, but let's maintain this notion that we should provide ourselves with a strong national defense, and it should be based on a military threat first and foremost. So that's reducing federal government expenditures by 43%. I believe in free markets. I believe there's a magic to free markets. Free market approaches to health care, free market approaches to energy, free market approaches to education. What's the best thing that the federal government could do when it comes to education in this country? I think it's to abolish the Federal Department of Education, and here's why. The Federal Department of Education gives each state about 11 cents out of every dollar that every state spends. But it comes with 16 cents worth of strings and mandates attached to it. So it's a negative to take the 11 cents. People don't recognize that it costs money to take federal money. Let Washington keep their money. That's money we don't have to send them in the first place to have it sent back as less money to begin with. And do you all know when the Department of Education was established in this country? I think most people are surprised to find out that it was 1979 that the Department of Education was established. Just get the Department of Education eliminated, give education to the states, 50 laboratories of innovation and best practice, and that's just what you'll have. Spectacular success by some states that'll get emulated, some miserable failure by other states that'll get avoided, but in a 50-state laboratory, we're going to improve education in this country dramatically, as opposed to Washington knows best, Washington top-down really has the answers. I am not in the debates. Out of 15 debates, I've been in 2 of the debates. And may I explain to you why I haven't been in the debates? You might be thinking, well, it's because you don't have a certain percentage in the polls. Well, I'm not in the polls that they're determining whether or not I get into the debates. That's not fair. CNN, 5 CNN polls ago, had me at 2% of the national vote. That tied me with Kane. That put me ahead of Huntsman and Santorum. In their next 4 national polls, they took my name off of the poll. When the networks determine who gets in the debates, they're saying you have to have a certain percentage, you have to have a certain polling in A, B, C poll. I'm not in A, B, C poll. By any measurement, that's not fair. During the last Fox debate, Fox chose to determine or interpret those rules as the last 5 national polls where my name was in the poll. I thought that was fair. And last week, CNBC held a debate where they had 2 criteria for the debate. One was you had to be registered to run for president, which I am. The other one was you had to be at 3% in any national poll before November 1st. You can't make that up, right? You can't make the result up either. I was at 3% in a Gallup poll in May. I was excluded from that debate, and CNBC refused to answer our calls to CNBC to demand inclusion in a debate based on their criteria. I'm not in the debate, but I think I offer a different voice in every single issue. And if I may give you an example of how I differ from every other candidate on that stage, and use immigration as that issue. When it comes to the debate on stage, candidate number 1 wants to build a fence across the border. Candidate number 2 wants to build a parallel fence to the first fence. Candidate number 3 wants to run a moat down the middle of those 2 fences. Candidate number 4 wants to run barbed wire across the top of the 2 fences. Candidate number 5 wants to electrify the barbed wire. And candidate number 6 wants to have drone patrols over the entire fence. The answer is to not build a fence. Don't build a fence. It would be an incredible waste of money. And then for the only candidate up there who doesn't want to build a fence, which is Rick Perry, who's a border governor, New Mexico former governor, border governor, don't build a fence. Build a fence around Washington to keep you in or out of Washington. If you decide you want to get in and out of Washington and there's a fence and you're telling me that that's going to keep you in or out, it's not. It's an incredible waste of money. But the only other governor that says don't build a fence is Rick Perry. But you know what Rick Perry has to say with regard to the drug violence on the border? And the fact that 40,000 people have died over the last 4 years because of the drug violence? He wants to add guns to that equation. He wants to militarize the border even more than it already is. So combat guns with more guns, and actually every other candidate on stage also agrees with that, with the exception of Ron Paul. But Ron Paul wants to build a fence. I'm not sure why that's the case. Don't build the fence. Make it as easy as possible for somebody that wants to come into this country and work to get a work visa. Not a green card, not citizenship, but just a work visa so that we can conduct a background check and make sure that there aren't criminals coming into the country. We can give them a social security card so that applicable taxes would get paid. And if we implement the fair tax, it won't even be an issue because the fair tax is unavoidable. Whether you're a legal or illegal immigrant or a visitor, everybody pays the fair tax. It's unavoidable. And then when it comes to border violence, legalize marijuana. And arguably 75% of the border violence with Mexico will go away because that's the estimate of the drug cartel's activities that are engaged in the marijuana trade. If we can't connect the dots between 40,000 deaths south of the border over the last 4 years with prohibition and the fact that when we prohibited alcohol, disputes got played out on the streets with machine guns, got played out in the streets with guns as opposed to in the courts. Let's get these issues in the courts. Let's bring an end to border violence. Let's bring an end to the violence that exists in this country because of drug prohibition. So I am the different voice. I wouldn't be in this contest if it weren't about the issues. It's about the issues. And it's about an optimism about the future of this country. We can fix these issues. Social Security is an issue that also comes up. Under the fair tax, you won't pay Social Security anymore as part of the withholding out of your payroll check. You'll get your full payroll check, and your employer won't pay the match to Social Security anymore. The proceeds for the fund for Social Security will come out of the fair tax. But Social Security is not cutting Social Security. Very simply, Social Security is a system that needs to take in more money than what it pays out. So to do that, we can raise the retirement age. We can have a means testing that's very fair, and that would be that if you paid in a certain amount of money into Social Security, which in the fair tax, this becomes a non-issue. But for those that have paid into Social Security, here's what you paid in, here's what your employer has matched that. A means testing would be, should you be able to get more money back than what you paid in if you're making a certain amount of money? I think a means testing would be something very fair, and it would save a lot of money when it comes to Social Security. And also change the escalator that's built into Social Security from the wage index to the inflation rate. So without exception, I think the issues of the day here need to be met by common sense solutions that really are optimistic. We should be optimistic about our future. We can set a course here where for the next 100 years we can have prosperity, we can have peace, and we can be vigilant to what are bad actors out there. And government has a role. Government absolutely has a role. Do I want to eliminate the EPA? No, I don't want to eliminate the EPA. I think there's a 43% largesse built into most government, that a 43% reduction in federal spending will really bleed out that largesse. But the EPA, for example, there are polluters. And as governor of New Mexico, I saw it. And if it wasn't for the EPA, they'd still be polluting to this day. But because of the EPA, we were able to shut them down. And I, as governor, was able to use that agency to be able to do that. So government has a role to protect us against individuals that would do us harm, and that's businesses that would do us harm, and government has a role to provide for a strong national defense, that we're not threatened militarily, and that our way of life ends up changed. I really appreciate all of you being here live. I really appreciate everybody on Yowie tonight. This is our third Yowie Town Hall. And really, this is an opportunity for anybody in the world to come online and ask a question and to participate in this forum. So I think we'll start that, and that will be a process of questions, comments, insults. Bring them on.
I think